and they also betrayed the hospitality rights given to them by the Palestinians. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. I feel the need to share and summarize with the common Muslim who may be oblivious of the historical context behind the root cause of the unjustified killings of the Palestinians over the last 75 plus years, much of which emanates from the much earlier British double dealings and how conflicting promises to the Arabs and the Jews created a legacy of bloodshed. The Jews were a small minority who had lived harmoniously with the Christians and much larger community of Muslims for hundreds of years. But the pillar of this harmony was crushed by the British dirty double dealing and the Balfour Declaration, which aided the autonomy for the Jews to make Palestine their homeland with celebrations and parade in support of Zionism. In the 19th century, 1897, when Theodor Herzl held his first Zionist Congress in Switzerland, he received support from the Swiss government, stating that Zionism strives to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, backed by public law. Wait a minute. Where does Theodor Herzl get this ideology from? This ideology of Zionism, where does Theodor Herzl get it from? It stems from an ideology which spread in the 16th and 17th century, persuading Jews to return to Palestine. And Zionism is a Jewish nationalist faction which emerged from Eastern Central Europe towards the end of the 19th century. You'll be surprised to know that Zionists had made several unsuccessful autonomous negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, in order to allow Jewish mass settlement in Palestine. Of course, this ideology of Zionism was rejected by the Ottomans, and it went to the British to allow him establish a settlement in the British territories in eastern part of Egypt in Sinai Peninsula, of which this proposal failed. In 1903, a year before the death of Theodor Herzl, the British then offered him a 6,000 square mile of uninhabited land in the eastern part of Africa. Guess which country? Uganda, which means that the Jews will take part of Ugandan land as their very own home. But guess what? It triggered some serious conflict, particularly amongst the Jewish Russians. And this was unsuccessful too. Anyway, it was during this period that Theodor Herzl died of heart attack. With the goal to forcefully create a Jewish state, Theodor's objective led to many historical models, which we will learn about later on. Just before World War I, Zionism had only gained and represented the views of minority of Jews, most of whom again were from Russia and led by the Austrians and the Germans. After the wave of Russian evolution in around 1905, some Russian Jewish youth migrated to Palestine as a pioneer settler, and by 1914 the Jewish population increased to around 90,000. Two volatile Zionists by the name of Chaim Weizmann and Nahum Sokolow took over the leadership of Zionist movement after the death of Theodor Herzl, and they obtained the very famous Balfour Declaration in 1917 from the British. So what is Balfour Declaration? Balfour Declaration is a written statement that declares its full support for the Jews to take over the Palestinians' land as the national home. This Balfour Declaration is equivalent to the statement made by the Swiss government in 1897, which basically gives its full support to the Zionists. And this Balfour Declaration was composed by the very famous Conservative Party British politician. What's his name? Arthur James Balfour, who later became the British Prime Minister. He expresses his official approval of Zionism. Can you imagine that? So the Jewish population continued to grow in Palestine from about 108,000 in 1925 to about 238,000 by 1933. So they were already settling in the land of Palestinians illegally until the outbreak of World War II. And at this point, the Palestinian Arabs feared that the Jews will eventually take over their land, which is what is happening now. Due to the increase in migration of the Jewish settlers, just as we see happening now, the Arab did subvert Zionism and the British policy supporting it, but to no avail. It is important to bear in mind that there were opposition among the high echelon Jewish leaders who virtually opposed Zionism ideology, and they issued a statement stating that Zionism is a capitalist plot. That's why when the Communist Party in Russia took over leadership, they exposed and even published the secret treaties Britain and its allies has been engineering on the ground. These secret treaties include selling and sharing large sections of the world amongst themselves. And on the other hand, they were preaching to the public something which is completely contrary to their secret planning and dealings, while they were also telling the Palestinian Arabs fictitious promises. Can you see where the double dealing emanates from? So due to revolutionary and uprising pressure, Britain eventually reassesses its policies in order to maintain peace between the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs. Britain will later on also impose some restriction on the Jews from migrating or from settling in Palestine, in exception to the fact that if the Palestinians voluntarily allows them to migrate and settle on their land, which regrettably they shouldn't have even allowed the Jews to settle on their land, because that is one of the contributing factors of what is happening in the current time. Again, the Zionists disagree with the British blockade, and this led to the Zionist underground group, such as Stengurg and Hurgum Zvai Lehumi, who carried out several acts of terrorism and assassinations against the British. At the strike of World War II, European Jews will later seek refuge in the land of the Palestinians due to their extermination in Germany. Meanwhile, tension continued to grow between the Arab Palestinians and the Zionists. The consequences of the British Balfour Declaration and other policies was to encourage Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism in Palestine, but unfortunately it only favored the Jews. Having complicated the situation extensively, the British then sought a resolution which will later reflect the double dealings of the British, and eventually the resolution led to partitioning of Palestine into Arab and the Jewish state in 1947, and ultimately the internalization of Jerusalem. Therefore, in 1948, guess what? Israel was born, and later on, Hebrew University will be commissioned as an intellectual hub for Zionism. It's like saying, build a university for ISIS, build a university for Al-Qaeda in America. It was completely shocking and unacceptable to the neighboring Arabs, and it triggered invasion. They were sadly defeated by the Israeli army with the full support of allied nations such as the British and the French. After this invasion, the Jews then continues to illegally expand their settlement in Palestine under the United Nations Autonomy. And by 1949, about 800,000 Palestinians had fled their homeland, and some Palestinians were forcefully expelled from their homes, and those areas that were illegally occupied are now called Israel. Back to the British double dealings. In order for them to retain their geopolitical power, they perpetuated the conflict in Palestine, an example of which was from the breakout of political power between the Arabs and the Ottomans. Britain and France then used this opportunity to seduce the local Arab leaders, one of them by the name of Sharif Hussein, who was one of the ruler of the Arab land, to side with them, i.e. the British and the France, for the destruction of the Ottomans. Because the Ottomans had a strong hold of leadership and they considered themselves as the true representative of Islam. Although the Ottomans did rely on the counterforce of Hussein, but Hussein sees the Ottomans as his rivalry, both on nationalistic and geopolitical level. Also, Hussein wanted to see the defeat of the Ottomans by the European power, Britain and France, etc. So he eventually sided with the British and the France for the destruction of the Ottomans. And the reason for this is because the British and the French had promised Sharif Hussein Arab independence in order to acquire more logistical economic development for the growth and fulfillment of his ambition on building and having his own controlled Arab nation. Anyway, the Arabs were successfully deceived by Britain and its ally with the delusion of gaining full support for the Arab nationalistic idea of independence, thus making Britain to honor her pledges to the Jews and completely ignoring the Arabs' hope for independence. And as a matter of fact, the British aided the migration and the settlement of the Jews in Palestine with military and police protection for the Jews. Most especially the 1930s and the 1940s saw a rapid increase of Jewish settlement in Palestine. This polarization served as an incursion for the Palestinians and the fulfillment of historic rights for the Jews. So putting these incidents into contextual analysis, it is important to note that the Arab, they had strong case but weak advocates, while the Jews had a very weak case but strong and brilliant advocates, which eventually led the Palestinians to the disenfranchised and deprivation of their homeland. Yet, the overall root cause emanates from the much earlier British double dealings and how conflicting promises of the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews created a legacy of bloodshed of the innocent Palestinians. This is just a summary of an historical contextualized narrative, which in the name of establishing a settlement for the Jews on another man's land has now become a great challenge for the international community and authority to mediate and promote peace between the Palestinians and the Jews. Nevertheless, it is important to also note that the war currently does not just start with Palestine. It is important to note that the Zionists lobbied for a settlement from the Ottomans, but they were rejected. Their proposal to have Sinai Peninsula as the settlement also failed. They lobbied with the British, who offered them settlement in Uganda, but due to their devouring ferociousness, they rejected the offer. And eventually, they had Palestine. And they also betrayed the hospitality right given to them by the Palestinians after the World War II. Imagine someone occupying your land, your home, your territory illegally, and then eventually forcefully shooting at you, bombing you up, killing your innocent family, and kicking you out of your land. What would be your reaction? Allah says in the Quran in Surah Al-Ibrahim, chapter 14, verse 42, Allah says, "And never think that Allah is unaware of what the wrongdoers do. He only delays them for a day when the eyes will stare in horror."